Welcome to Film Forum Presents, a podcast featuring special live events recorded at our theater located at 209 West Houston Street in downtown Manhattan. In this episode, Film Forum presents two events. From our archive, an introduction by former New York Police Department Commissioner Bill Bratton, who appeared with Don Siegel's 1968 crime drama, MADIGAN, as part of our NYPD repertory series in 2011. You'll also hear a recent Q&A with Paul Laverty, screenwriter of Ken Loach's acclaimed drama, Sorry We Missed You, which is now available for rental in our virtual cinema. But first, a new weekly segment. With the theater temporarily closed due to COVID-19, we are asking our audience to share their favorite memory of Film Forum, a selection of which we will include on the podcast each week. For our inaugural segment, we have the following from Jean Lawton, who sent this message all the way from South Dakota.
This is Jean from out in the Badlands. I have many, many memories of the fabulous Film Forum from the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s before I moved out of the city. One that popped into my head was watching Clara Bow in a talkie call her savage as she's riding her horse and then whipping a rattlesnake to death with her whip. The audience lost it. The place was packed. It was a hoot. It's just so great. I remember standing in line, waiting to get into each film, being surrounded by other film lovers, the depth and variety of the series that you showed. It's just a true gift to the city. Miss you. Thank you.
If you would like to share your favorite Film Forum memory, we'd love to hear from you. What movie, series, event, or other hhappening made you love our cinema or value the communal movie-going experience? You can either record a voice note and email it to ffpresentspodcast@gmail.com or call 760-933-7082 and leave a voicemail. Again, that's ffpresentspodcast@gmail.com or call 760-933-7082. Please keep your submissions to 1 minute or less. And now, here's Bruce Goldstein, Film Forum's Director of Repertory Programming, to introduce our first event segment.
In 2001, I programmed a 50-film festival for Film Forum called NYPD, spotlighting many of the great movies featuring the New York City Police Department. Classics like Laura, Detective Story, The Big Heat, Shaft, The Naked City, and Serpico, and lesser-known films like The Tattooed Stranger, Where the Sidewalk Ends, Cry of the City, Who Killed Teddy Bear, and many others. Also included was Don Siegel's 1968 thriller Madigan, starring Richard Widmark and Henry Fonda, and based on the 1962 novel The Commissioner by Richard Dougherty. I'd read somewhere that former New York City Police Commissioner William Bratton had read the novel as a teenage boy growing up in a Boston suburb. It was Dougherty's book that inspired Bratton to go into law enforcement. So I contacted Mr. Bratton's office, hoping he'd agree to introduce Madigan. The next day, I got a call from Mr. Bratton himself. I'd be thrilled, he said. The screening, planned months ahead, was scheduled for September 16, 2001. The day after the events of 9/11, I got a call from Mr. Bratton's office, apologizing that he'd be unable to introduce the screening. The apology was entirely unnecessary, of course, but the call demonstrated his complete professionalism. That's not the end of the story, though. In 2011, the 10th anniversary of 9/11, I reprised the NYPD festival, including films that we had to cancel the first time around. One of those films was Madigan, and I re-invited Mr. Bratton, who again graciously accepted. By this time, he'd already finished his term as Police Commissioner of Los Angeles. 3 years later, he'd serve another term as New York's Police Commissioner. So here is Bill Bratton's long-delayed introduction to Madigan, recorded at Film Forum in September 2011. Following the intro, I'll come back for a postscript. I'm Bruce Goldstein, Film Forum's Repertory Program Director. Thank you. Didn't expect that. Exactly 10 years ago, we presented our first NYPD festival, which included tonight's movie, Madigan, Don Siegel's 1968 thriller starring Richard Widmark and Henry Fonda, who plays New York's police commissioner. And you can see some beautiful shots of the palatial old police headquarters on Center Street, now the police building condominium complex, although most of it was shot on the back lot at Universal. You'll see some scenes at Universal, beautiful shots from New York, then they cut to the back lot. It's very obvious, but it's very effective anyway. That screening was scheduled for September 16th, 2001, and was to have been introduced by the celebrated former police commissioner of New York, William J. Bratton. But the tragedy of 9/11 forced us to shut down for a week, and we had to cancel that screening as well as Mr. Bratton's introduction. But now, 10 years later, we're delighted that he's again accepted our invitation. Bill Bratton. He's got his own cheering squad here. Bill Bratton is, of course, the only person to have led the two largest police forces in the U.S., the LAPD and the NYPD, not to mention Boston and the transit police. And he was even tapped to run Scotland Yard. And he would have if not for some Home Office ruling that you had to be English or something. But that didn't stop Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II from conferring upon him the title of Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, or CBE. Mr. Bratton is now chairman of Kroll, the world's leading risk consulting company, and he was recently named by Security Magazine as one of the most influential people in the business. And his acclaimed autobiography, Turnaround, was published by Random House in 1998. It's our very great pleasure to welcome, better late than never, America's most famous true-life crime fighter, Bill Bratton.
Thank you, Bruce. Good evening. Those of you who have not seen this movie are really in for a treat. In 1963, as an avid reader at the age of 16 and a great fan of the New York City Police Department, a department that I had admired from afar growing up in the city of Boston, the first book that I came across about the NYPD was entitled Your Police. It was a children's picture book, and it was depicting the police department of 1953, the NYPD. I fell in love with that book, used to check it out at the library continuously, and a few years ago I received as a gift a copy of that book. The second book that I came across about the NYPD that influenced my life very significantly and effectively influenced all your lives. Those of you who lived in New York in the 1990s and remember what the city was like in the early 1990s. That second book was entitled The Commissioner by Richard Daughtry, who was a writer, reporter for one of the now defunct New York papers, but he covered the police beat. And in this book, I fell in love with it. The description of the commissioner going down Park Avenue on his way down to the old police headquarters, and at every other intersection on Park Avenue, the uniformed traffic cops saluting him as he went by in his Lincoln Continental limousine. And the depiction of him arriving into the police headquarters, and the word spreading immediately through the building and through the city that the PC has now arrived and is at work. And that's exactly how I found it 35 years later when I was privileged to become the police commissioner of New York City in 1994. The movie you were about to see was, in fact, produced and directed in 1968. I never got to see the movie until about 3 years ago when I was privileged to introduce this movie at UCLA. The print that you are seeing tonight is the print that UCLA has. It's one of the last surviving prints of this movie. I never got to see it in 1968. I was serving in Vietnam at that time and eventually got a copy of an old VHS of it. And so tonight I'm looking forward for the second time to seeing it on the wide screen. That screen's not very wide, but I think it's a lot bigger than the television sets I'm used to watching it on. It is, this movie, I think, one of the 5 or 6 that I would describe as accurately giving you a sense of what the New York City Police Department is like. The first was Naked City, which is also appearing during this period of time. Barry Fitzgerald and others. Police Department in the 40s. This, I think, accurately depicts the police department of 1963, and in many respects was the police department that I found and headed in the 1990s. Others that have in this series of movies being presented at this theater complex, Serpico, I think, was an accurate reflection of the corruption of the 1970s in the New York City Police Department. And certainly The French Connection, a phenomenal movie. I'm good friends with Billy Friedkin, the director of that movie. I believe that is also playing here. Another one that is less well-known, Detective Story, with Kirk Douglas and William Bendix. I would recommend that one highly, about detectives in the 1940s precinct station.
One of the films in the first NYPD series, and one of my personal top 10 NYC films of all time, was The Taking of Pelham 123, which we had scheduled before 9/11. For this one, I invited former Mayor Ed Koch to introduce the picture simply because the mayor in the movie resembled His Honor. I was amazed when Mr. Koch agreed to introduce the picture. Koch began his remarks by saying that he only came because he thought Film Forum was a gem and he wanted to show his support. He continued, "Mr. Goldstein asked me here because they say I look like the mayor in the movie. Except that guy is a schmuck." Following the events of 9/11, the city, like now, was at a standstill. Everything below Houston Street was closed for months, but luckily, Film Forum was right on the northern side of the line, so we were able to reopen after only 2 weeks. The NYPD festival was to have ended with a one-week run of William Friedkin's The French Connection in a new 35mm print. One day later, less than a week after 9/11, I got a phone call out of the blue. It was director Billy Friedkin, who I'd never spoken to in my life. "I hear you're showing The French Connection," he said. "Yes, we have a new 35mm print," I answered proudly. "Well, I've got a better one," he said. He then shipped us his own personally supervised 35mm print in pristine condition, and that was our reopening repertory film. Whether we'd recapture our audience was another question. I needn't have worried. Our reopening night was jam-packed, and it was like that for the rest of the run. It was clear that people needed to be reconnected, and we hope to reconnect with you very soon. Please stay well and safe.
We hope you enjoyed that event from our archive. Next up, Film Forum presents Paul Laverty, longtime screenwriting partner of the essential British realist filmmaker Ken Loach, whose latest film, Sorry We Missed You, opened at Film Forum on March 4th and is currently available to rent in our virtual cinema. Like most of their collaborations, Sorry We Missed You vividly portrays the daily lives of the British working class, made all the more timely by its focus on the toll the so-called gig economy takes on a Newcastle family. Laverty appeared in conversation with James Bandler, senior reporter for the nonprofit news organization ProPublica, on March 7th.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Film Forum. My name is Joseph Berger. I'm the Theater Operations and Events Manager here. And we are very proud to present the U.S. theatrical premiere of Ken Loach's Sorry We Missed You. It is the 13th collaboration between Mr. Loach, the great British director, and screenwriter Paul Laverty. One of Loach's closest collaborators for the past 25 years, Laverty wrote the scripts for My Name is Joe, Sweet 16, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, I, Daniel Blake, and 9 other Loach-directed features. 2 of Loach's films have won the Palme d'Or, the highest honor at the Cannes Film Festival. Both were written by Paul Laverty, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, and I, Daniel Blake. Laverty's script for Sweet 16 won the Best Screenplay prize at Cannes as well. We are very excited to welcome Paul Laverty back to Film Forum this afternoon. With Sorry We Missed You, Mr. Loach and Mr. Laverty set their sights on the so-called gig economy and introduce us to a family struggling to stay above water in a new kind of workforce. We are pleased to be partnering with the esteemed nonprofit news organization ProPublica for today's screening. Joining Paul for a discussion following the film will be ProPublica senior reporter James Bandler, who, along with his ProPublica colleagues, Patricia Callahan and Doris Burke, and Ken Bensinger and Carolyn O'Donovan of BuzzFeed News, has reported extensively on the human price of the gig economy, with a specific focus on Amazon's prioritization of speed of delivery over driver safety. Prior to his time at ProPublica, Mr. Bandler was a reporter at Fortune, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, and many others. So please stick around. In about 100 minutes, we will have a wonderful conversation with Mr. Bandler and Mr. Laverty. Enjoy. Folks, please welcome our guest moderator this afternoon, James Bandler, and screenwriter, Mr. Paul Laverty.
Thanks. Does anyone have a dry eye here?
I do, yeah.
Well, I've seen it 3 times, and my colleague Ken Bensinger from BuzzFeed watched this, and it hit the reality of it better than we could in print. The emotion of it, the destruction of lives. I watch it, and I'm dumbfounded by it. So first of all, I want to thank you.
Well, thank you very much, James.
So I'd love to just ask you. I don't like to be interviewed. I like to interview. So I'd love to know how you started this project and how it came about.
Well, thank you for your work too. I mean, not everyone is digging in under the surface, and I wish we had more journalists like you in the UK, because it was very, very hard to get the information for this film. And it was the starting point, I suppose, was, I don't know if you saw a previous little film we did called I, Daniel Blake, but in the course of that, we went up and down the country talking to people in food banks, I think. They're kind of like soup kitchens, I think you call them here. But what really struck us, it wasn't just like in, times gone past when it had been the unemployed or people who are ill who are going to get food. It was people who are working, and it was precarious work. We met lots of people in 0-hour contracts, just like Abby in the film. They get a couple of hours in the morning, then they've got a fallow period, and then they'll do the stuff at lunchtime again. Then in the evening they'll do the tuck-ins. And so their whole day was stretched out. And it was remarkable. And sometimes, or another day they could be just dumped, and then the next day they'd be, I talked to a young carer and she showed me her phone. If I had this on the screen, this is the thing about doing the research, and I'm sure you found this. You hear stories you just would not believe. You think you were testing credibility. She showed me her phone, and she'd received over 40 texts and calls that day to come in and do more work. Just quite remarkable. And then, of course, it led us to look at the whole question of the couriers and the drivers, and what really struck me there, James, right at the very beginning, was I used to be a lawyer in a previous lifetime, and I looked at these new contracts. I was actually stunned by them. That language, onboarding. The first scene in the film. You're not hired. You come on board. You don't work for us. You work with us. And all this language. I mean, big, long contracts. Uber are doing exactly the same thing just now, and many other countries. And it's like this great big conjuring trick. Owner, driver, franchisee. It's your choice. It's your freedom. And they sell this notion of free choice. And of course, it's absolutely, totally bullshit when you actually speak to them and you talk to them their lived experience. Because one fell swoop, they're transferring all risk from the corporation to the driver. And some of the stories you hear from the drivers, you just wouldn't believe. I don't know even where to start. Talk to a young guy, Jamie. When I'm watching the end of this film, I always think of him. He was a young driver. He had a young family, 2 young kids. His wife was 30 and she was dying of terminal cancer. And all he asked the company was, can you just give me a few less shifts? They gave him more, and it's hard to believe that. And he showed me the material, and it wasn't like the manager was actually trying to screw him. It was just that the system took over. They needed him, and the machine ran on. Somebody coming in with a broken foot, driving a van with a cast on his foot. I think of Ruth Lane, whose husband died of diabetes because he missed very, very important appointments. Cases like this, and because people think we're exaggerating. There's some people who do well, and they're young, and you get a good route, and everything goes well, and they can make quite a lot of money. But did you know?
Yeah.
Well, I said, it'd be very interesting actually. What was does it ring true here for the American experience?
It rang really true, and if anything, I think it understates the plight of a lot of drivers. And I think the British model was what a certain big delivery company that delights customers chose when they first began this experiment. So what you see here was sort of Amazon's early sort of prototyping, where they would hire contractors who would hire contractors. And they decided on this model after a lot of experimentation. It's like a big tech company, that's sort of the motto is fail fast and fail often. And they liked the model of contractor because they could pass off the risk, and they could also avoid problems of unionization and labor problems. So the American model is very similar to this, except for the fact that they employ contractors who have employees, and that's because of American labor laws. But everything from the technology is you've nailed it. Amazon now uses a phone, not a device. It's called a Rabbit, and it is still, after years of testing, a nightmare for drivers. As recently as a year ago in the UK, drivers were driving sometimes on the right side of the road in the UK. So it's conforming a human being to an algorithm, and it's a merciless algorithm. So I think that you really nailed that.
Well, thanks, James. It's very interesting what you say, because in previous, films, I've always had to do a lot of digging around. In Daniel Blake, we had to go and speak to whistleblowers. But for this one, it was so difficult because, like you've said, there's such an anti-trade union policy. The people are so vulnerable. They're working so hard. They're on the move. So it was very, very hard to find drivers to speak to. So I eventually just gave up on, you always think you find somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. So I just went out to the car parks in the morning, and I went out to the car parks in the evening, and I just spoke to them. And then what was very interesting was, just persuaded some of them to let me come with them. And it's actually when you spend time with them during the day, then you really get the gold dust. For example, one of the young lads I met from Amazon, because Amazon will tell you, look, there's our statistics. There's when people sign on and do all this. But when I talked to him, he went out to a huge big Amazon warehouse. They had to be in a holding car park. He had to be there about an hour and a half beforehand so he could get out in the first wave. And in the car park, they weren't allowed to talk to each other. They said it was for safety reasons, but he knows it's because they were sharing stories. So, so of course, by the time he'd left home, got out of the holding car park, by the time he gets his gun, then they're counting the time. But all this previous time of 2 hours travel, etc., and in the holding car park, that was never counted. So everything is absolutely measured. And when you're with them, you'd see them at the end of the day. I mean, the young lads I went out with, they didn't have time to eat a sandwich. They had high energy drinks. They were running much faster than they were in the film. And you could just see the greyness in their eye. And in fact, there was a young lad who I got quite close to, a lovely fellow. He just had his second baby. And he just never saw his children. He just didn't see his children. And then by the time I'd written the script, we'd raised the money, we did the casting, we'd made the film, and the film came out, I tried to get in contact with him to ask him to come to see the film with his friends. And I couldn't trace him, and I found out from one of his friends he was having mental health problems. And I'm convinced if I had done that job for 18 months like he did that short period he did it, I would have had mental health problems. So it's a massively profitable model for Jeff Bezos and for shareholders, but it actually crunches and destroys the people that I met. They were just run into the ground. You could see their faces at the end of the day. They were just grey.
So I have a question for you. You got every detail right. The delivery station manager, Maloney, he's a bald guy with a penchant for sweater vests and libertarian language. Was that intentional? He's missing the drooping eye, but there's...
Oh, well, that's very funny. I never thought of that, really. I know we like social realism, but perhaps no, that's a bit too much. Yeah. Mr. Jeff Bezos. He was a lovely lad. He was a guy called Ross, who was a local policeman who had never acted before. And but I remember talking to Ross. He's actually a big, gentle softie. He's a lovely man, really lovely man. But I was saying to him, you're not the bad guy in this. Because you remember William Blake, he came out, William Blake, the great English mystic from 200 years ago. Many of you'll know his work, his beautiful poems and his beautiful drawings. But he talked about mind-forged manacles. And I think that's what happens when you gain hold of the narrative. you kind of capture the language of freedom. You know, the Ricky believes he's going to be an owner-driver franchisee. He thinks he's going to expand his franchise. He thinks he's going to win for his family. And so you need Maloney's.
Yeah.
You need those people who are going to say, I am going to form a protective carapace over this depot. We're going to win the contracts because that's how I'm going to protect your families. And that is the logic. I mean, there was an article in the New Yorker about Amazon. I think it was, the original title was Relentless, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You know, so relentlessly crushing the opposition. So I don't think Maloney, it's like the grapes of wrath, isn't it? You know, who makes the decisions? Who makes the decisions behind the bankers?
And
the black box, the algorithms.
It's like that all the way up the company. Amazon hires hundreds of people to be what's called user experience experts. And the idea is we want to have empathy. We want to put ourselves in the driver's shoes. But those people often leave heartbroken. They realize that there's such a great force of this overarching mission, which is delight the customer, get the package there at all costs, and grow at this insane clip, that they don't last. They're heartbroken. They're managers who are brought there to try to make the place safer, who have left just completely broken. So it's not like people want to do good there, but the system, as you say, is so relentless.
Yeah, well, maybe we should just lock all the executives in their office and give them a plastic bottle each and lock them up for 14 hours, you know, as a little thought experiment. Yeah.
I mean, the head of this unit that runs logistics has begun meetings with newcomers saying, in the old days when I was back in the fulfillment centers, they called me the assassin. It was because I would take out the slackers. I would look around for the slackers and take them out. Again, this is in the service of this greater mission of our pleasure, our happiness of getting our cat litter delivered in a day. But in the course of this, people get run over, people get killed, and then there's this emotional toll, which is families broken up by this. So, again, I think what you've done is so important in capturing this the emotion and the wasted life. And I just can't thank you enough as a reporter for honoring the facts so well too.
Well, thanks you, James. It really means a lot coming from an investigative journalist. It really does, because I think it is really, really important to get the detail right, and I think the detail is often more fantastical than you'd ever imagine, and also that's one half of the equation. But Abby's work, to me, was just equally important. I think women's work is constantly undermined. He spent time with these carers. They were absolutely remarkable people. It's a really tough, difficult job, how to manage people with dementia. Maybe some of you know from parents or family, but just the multitasking, the skill in trying to deal with people who've got, great difficulties. But what was amazing again now is, especially after austerity in the UK, the cuts to local authorities. So now they're having to do these things in 15-minute visits, which is almost impossible. So you actually talk to some of these carers who are absolutely, I met brilliant people, but they were pushed right to the very, very limit and feeling absolutely guilty, torn. Everything that happened in the film were stories I got from people, So, and it really does beg the question, doesn't it? What is the point of work if we can't look after our children? And I don't know what the statistics are here in the United States, but the problems now with teenagers with mental health problems, it's just absolutely remarkable. And I think if you're a parent, it's not just being there, it's actually having time there where you're not exhausted. You're not just doing the family administration, you're not giving them a row, you're not following up, but just time to be, to enjoy, and those kind of subtle relationships that, if you're not with them, especially, that always gets me with Seb there. He's 15. I don't know how many you've got children remember with having teenagers, but they enter a period there where they've got to fight back, and you need energy to try and figure out what's going on. And if you're just exhausted all the time, or you're always giving them a row, I think it just breaks things down. And for so many teenagers now in the UK, they're just not spending time with their families.
There was a story we weren't able to tell in our article, which was about a driver who had only been on the job for 2 weeks. He was in Boston. His name was Jeffrey Williams. And after 2 weeks of this job, he realized he was not going to make it through the winter. It was going to be, the pace was too hectic. He was working 14 hours a day. He wasn't getting back to see his wife, who he'd married only a month before. And on a day before, on his last day of deliveries, he told his wife, "I don't think I can do this job. If I get in if I get in a fight with my manager, I'm just going to quit on the spot. She was relieved. That was the last thing he said. He walked out the door. He came back and said, "I just hate this job," to her. He drove to, instead, for this delivery route, they had to drive to a separate parking lot, which was miles away from the delivery station. They weren't paid for this time. On the way to the route, he sped. He got in a crash. He was killed instantly at the crash. Those were the last words he said to his wife. Jeff Bezos is not responsible directly for the death. He wasn't on the clock. He'll never get he won't get disability for it. But the stress he was under, I believe, killed him. The reason he was speeding. And I think there are countless stories like that. They don't always end in death, but again.
That's fun, because I found a journalist, James, I never had time to follow this up properly, but they told me of a manager for Amazon who had resigned because drivers had fallen asleep at the wheel and they just couldn't take the stress of managing and having the responsibility. And they said there was, I mean, I didn't follow this up, but there was lots and lots of stories, you know, about accidents. So I really do wonder about it. But what I think is fascinating, though, is the whole use of technology just now. You know, because, I mean, they are, it is quite an incredible machine. You know, I remember just being almost like in Katie's shoes with the machine, you know, realising this could monitor and measure absolutely everything. When you read the stories of what's happening to people in the warehouses, it measures every step, you know. Painkillers are dispensed at these warehouses. You know, so it really is quite incredible when they've created such an anti-trade union environment as well, hiring psychologists so workers will not go with trade unions. And I think it really does beg the really great big question after climate change is just this massive inequality. You know, and really what's happening and how this politics and this technology is being used now. We had the most remarkable screening, you know, in Europe, in various countries in Europe with this one, but one that really got me was one we did in France. And they filled up an old theatre. It was one of these old ones in the Champs-Élysées. 1,000 people turned up. And it was chambermaids, it was couriers, it was postmen, it was people, carers, all those jobs that really make the world go round. And they were so upset after seeing the film. And they came up and they took the microphone and they said what their lives were like. They were working longer hours than ever. They were getting paid less. They weren't getting to the end of the month. And they were absolutely furious. You know, so I think there really is a massive, huge question now of, you know, gross systematic inequality, which is right at the heart of the system itself. And I think, you know, I suppose Amazon is just one of many. You know.
I think so. Well, thank you guys so much.
So let's thank our guests, James and Paul. And I think both of you gentlemen will come out into the lobby and spend a little more time with us. Let's all go into the lobby and continue the conversation there. Thanks very much for coming, folks.
Thank you. But we have to take them on. We have to take them on. Thanks.
Special thanks to Zeitgeist Films and ProPublica for making this event possible. If you like what you just heard, please be sure to subscribe to get future episodes and rate and review so that more movie lovers can find us. Film Forum is an independent nonprofit cinema, and our doors have been kept open for nearly 50 years thanks to the invaluable support of our members and donors. Please visit www.filmforum.org for details on membership, as well as information and showtimes for our current programming. See you at the movies.